And yeah, I'm very proud to introduce the SWIP 22 keynote speaker, Stacey Ellison Kessin. Yeah, she's still here in the room. Yeah, hello, Stacey. Um, she has been part of the SWIP community for some time now, being an active member of the Wikidata and open data community. She has already co-facilitated a Wikibase workshop with Dan Scott when we would still meet in person. That was at SWIP 2018 in Bonn. Stacey is a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario with kinship connections to the Georgian Bay Métis community and Indigenous community in Canada. An assistant professor at the School of Information Management at Dalhousie University, Stacey engages in work and research related to metadata, knowledge organization, and Indigenous matters in libraries and the wider cultural heritage sector. Stacey is a passionate advocate for change in information structures and metadata systems within the library profession. She is the chair of the International Association of Library Associations Indigenous Matters Standing Committee and the community chair for the Language Preservation and Instruction Community and a member of the Council of the National Indigenous Knowledge and Language Association, which is an Indigenous-led association centered in Canada. Stacey also has extensive professional experience as a librarian, as she has been serving in a variety of roles in the libraries at York University. So, Stacey, the stream is yours. We are eager to listen to your keynote.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That's amazing. I just want to say hello, everybody, and I'm just so delighted to be here today, and I want to thank the program committee for the invitation to speak to you all in this role as keynote. And I also want to say welcome to everyone who's joining us on this live stream today. While I think I do miss meetings in person, I also recognize that these online conferences or meeting online allow far greater access to all of the wonderful presentations that are going to be happening throughout the week. So I'm going to start off today with giving you a little bit more background about myself, situating myself in relation to this topic and this work of decolonization. That's an important part, actually, of how we relate to doing decolonization work. So being able to situate ourselves and really being able to do that, because it helps resist or push back against the idea that there's, objectivity in our data, in our relationships with each other, and relationships with the work that we do. So Adrian gave me such a lovely introduction, but just to add a little bit more to that. So you heard that I am a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. But more than that, also, I will say that my mom's family are settlers to the country now known as Canada from Scotland and England and actually Germany. And my dad's family, my dad's dad his family came to Canada in the early part of the 19th century from Ireland. And my dad's mother is Métis. So for those who don't know, that is an Indigenous category, recognized category within Canada, relatively recently recognized. So only in the 1980s with Section 35, so the repatriation of the Constitution. And it is a community or nation that comes from the bringing together of fur traders in primarily French and Scottish and First Nations women. So my forefathers are French fur traders who were active in the Upper Great Lakes and out to the historic Northwest. And my foremothers were Ojibwe, Menominee, and Ottawa. And this is important for you to know because it helps also situate me in relation to land. So what territories am I connected to? And you also heard Adrienne mention that I'm most closely connected right now to the area that's known as the Georgian Bay Métis community, and sometimes called half-breed community, which is has been regarded as a derogatory term, but is also being reclaimed in some ways. So that good to know, again, in relation to my own work, how this relates to myself. Now, frequently in Canada and probably other places you may have heard, perhaps in the United States, Australia, or Aotearoa, in New Zealand, that talks or events are sometimes opened with land acknowledgement. And in coming to do this talk today, I was thinking about, well, what does it mean to acknowledge the land? How do we think about that, especially we're in digital spaces and at a conference like this? Because oftentimes land acknowledgements, as they're frequently given in sort of formal settings, are criticized for being overly rote, with people potentially reading an institutional statement. And so it can not do the work that's intended to do. And the work of a land acknowledgement really is to do that, is to recognize that that land has been occupied by Indigenous people, because in day-to-day, certainly in North America, we can not see that presence. And so that's an important part of calling that occupation to attention. So of course, this is a data conference. So I was thinking maybe I should do my land acknowledgement today in a data format. Oh, and I also want to mention, it was mentioned before, but please do ask questions. I'm hoping we'll have some time for questions a little bit later. Certainly, this is an important discussion, and I would like us to have some time for discussion as much as is possible. So native land, what does that mean? And here is an item from Wikidata. As you heard in my introduction, I have been active in Wikidata for some time. I don't believe this item exists anymore, which is sad for me. Somebody can correct me though if I'm wrong. So this idea of territory occupied by Indigenous nations. So what does that mean? And certainly where I am right now, so I'm in Oakville, Ontario, which is just west of Toronto on the shores of Lake Ontario. And this land has been occupied by numerous Indigenous nations over time in memoriam. So we have the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee Nation, the Huron-Wendat, and the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So this land that I am a guest on, is native land. So when I look at the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and I think, again, in this land acknowledgement, I want us to unpack a little bit of some of the issues that we find in data when we talk about decolonization or Indigenous data. So I know that this territory is, the treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And we can see here that you might recognize this screenshot from VIAF that we have Wikidata as the correct label. But we see other authority records or data coming in to VIAF are actually incorrect, because in 2019, the Mississaugas of the New Credit changed their name to Mississaugas of the Credit. So this is a press release from almost, 3 years ago now. And so to actually call the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation New Credit is not correct. And so this brings up a point that I do want to talk about, this idea of labels and of naming, and how we make sure that the data that we have is correct, because it does matter when it comes to decolonization, because it is about recognition and visibility and self-determination. So I'm just going to go back here. And again, we can see this issue with this data as not having the correct label. And I did take you can see some of the details here that this has not been updated for some time. So I think, again, ask some questions for us in the community about how we ensure these records data are up to date and how we bring these things into account. And further to that, in land acknowledgements, another piece is to recognize treaties, whether land is ceded or unceded, is very typical. So again, thinking about a connection between a land acknowledgement and data, I went over to the open data set from the Government of Canada for historic treaties. And hopefully you can see this on your screen. Because the treaty that covers this area, which includes both purchases and treaties, so the heads of the lake purchase, Treaty 22, Treaty 18, I believe, which are called the numbered treaties known in Canada. These are historic treaties. Now, what I want to call your attention to in the context of the conversation today is how this data in this data set is relating to geographic boundaries. So when we talk about land acknowledgements and we're talking about territories, and we need to represent that territories in data. But the problem is when we read this, it says, however, the treaties of peace and neutrality signed between 1701 and 1760s are not represented in this data set because they do not have geographic boundaries that can be represented on a map. So here we see one of these friction points when we talk about decolonization and Indigenous data and representation certainly in Canada. And we can think about other situations where we might need to recognize territory. And I think it wouldn't take a far stretch for many people listening to this conversation to think about the challenges of geographic representation and this fundamental problem with recognizing treaty lands. And also part of this story of treaty lands, if you were to look further at this particular data set that talks about the differences in interpretation between the Crown or the Government of Canada and Indigenous nations that were signatories to these treaties around whether land was ceded in perpetuity or whether these were different kinds of conceptual relationships. So when we talk about data and we talk about decolonization, and we talk about things like land agreements or treaties or understandings of territories, it does matter the difference between what a colonial entity like the Crown or the Government of Canada considers to be a treaty versus the Indigenous people or the peoples who might have signed that treaty. And again, this while these are historic treaties, they have contemporary implications. And I'll just say that colonization, when we talk about it, is not historic. It is contemporary and ongoing in multiple ways. And we see the impacts of colonization moving ahead, even when nations no longer overtly are active in colonial activities. So we see that the impacts of things like these treaties move forward today in how land is understood and used and things like consultation. So further to a typical land acknowledgement in the area that I'm in, which is the area of Toronto and the lower Great Lakes region, is something called the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, or the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, or the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. It's very common to hear this as part of a land acknowledgement. And there are teachings that go along with this with understanding this agreement, I'm not going to relate that to you today. It's not something that I can take responsibility for. But I thought it was interesting to look at this Wikidata item, which I frankly had not looked at before. So yes, I could improve this item, but I have not. I have left it like this because I think it brings up a lot of questions. I actually do not know, without spending some time on it, how I would structure this. What statements should be included? What kind of statements are needed? How do I understand it? Who should be responsible for constructing something like this? Because it says a law used by Indigenous people, but it is actually specific to, it was a specific agreement between two Indigenous nations, not Indigenous people everywhere. Is it a law? Is it a covenant? It is related to an actual wampum belt, which is, I wish I had an image of it, but I couldn't find a good image that was openly available. So we don't have one here, but it is wampum. You do not know is beads made up of shells, and they quahog clam shells, and so the beads are white and then also purple. And these belts are meant to embody agreements or covenants. And so this belt that was constructed for the dish with one spoon actually does have an image. It's like white with a kind of purple bowl in the middle. And so this teaching and covenant is considered to still sort of cover this area that I live in. So how do we understand something like this dish with one spoon covenant in the context of linked data or in the context of Wikidata, or how should it be situated? I think these are important questions when we talk about decolonization, because again, they speak to understanding structures of self-governance, of law, of land use. And while I am talking about something that is specific to the area that I'm living in right now, it has ways that it can speak to other situations, and how we understand the need to also make sure that we're not doing things that are also pan-Indigenous, or that we're not universalizing things. So that, again, I would want to modify this label and provide enough context to show that while this agreement was between two specific Indigenous nations, it might have implications for all people who live in this territory, and moving forward through time. I also want to acknowledge that although we are hearing a lot about decolonization, certainly in the last few years, these efforts are not new. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge ongoing work over many years all over the world. And also to those who have more specifically aided my own thinking and work in this area. I am always learning and listening, and I really want to give my thanks and appreciation to all of those who have been working on decolonization or resisting colonization. So again, an important part to recognize that while this topic has gained more visibility and currency, a lot of these activities are not necessarily new. But what do we mean when we talk about decolonization? And again, in thinking about preparing for this talk, you know, sort of contending with, well, what does that mean? And certainly in Canada, there's a lot of criticism around decolonization efforts because of a seeming lack of action. On the other hand, I believe there has been quite a bit of increased activity, and certainly I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. We have seen lots of change happening in relation to things like data governance, but no simple definitions that I can throw up here that we can all read and then comfortably enact. It doesn't quite work that way. When we talk about decolonization, though, we have to turn the conversation and talk about what do we mean by colonialism. And this article by Eve Huck and Kay Yang is really one that is frequently mentioned in conversations about decolonization. I encourage you, it's open access, so you can have a look at it if you have some time, because they talk about how decolonization is not a metaphor, which means that decolonization is active. It is actually meant to address colonial power, to challenge colonial power, and to change really what are sort of fundamental structures of our societies. Again, speaking from sitting here in Canada, thinking about especially Western cultures that are founded on a lot of things that we take for granted or make assumptions about, but really are strongly connected to colonialism. And so an important quote that I like to pull from this particular article talks about settler colonialism, in that its action is connected to the removal of Indigenous people from land, disappearing Indigenous people. And so that happens in a number of ways. It's through tactics of assimilation. And those tactics of assimilation are things like you might have heard in Canada or the United States or Australia when we talk about boarding schools or residential schools that were really places to send children to be assimilated into white culture, but also restrictions on language and the practice of culture, the practice of ceremony. In Canada, the Indian Act actually prevented the practice of ceremony up into I believe the 1950s. And these tactics of assimilation are also connected to part of the reason why there are collections of ceremonial objects in museums. So even in countries that may not seem to have an active or current role in colonization, those tendrils or relationships with settler colonialism are still probably present in some way, either in archival collections, museum collections, potentially in libraries as well. And that is connected, again, to some of these tactics of assimilation, to removal from land, and also to genocide. So we'll just say I'm going to talk a little bit about issues around genocide and disappearance. So that is a warning about some of this content, but very, very briefly. And they talk further in the article around how this removal from land is not just a removal from a home, but that it actually represents, as they say, a profound epistemic and ontological cosmological violence. So this disruption and dislocation from land is also a dislocation of knowledge, of ways of knowing, and ways of being. So when we talk about libraries or information organizations or museums or universities, they are connected to settler colonialism. And in the ways that this removal from land, again, is actually a removal in many ways from knowledge. And going back to my previous slide where I was talking about also these tactics of assimilation, when we think about preventing people from engaging in their culture and that relationship to assimilation, but also to cultural heritage institutions. And as I've said, there are numerous ongoing connections between colonization, knowledge and culture, and libraries, archives, museums, and universities, and all of these institutions in colonial countries. So again, when we talk about North America, we can talk about Europe, Australia. All of these institutions are holding up colonization or ways of enacting colonial power, even though we may not notice or think about it. And Rupika Rizam talks about decolonization in digital humanities. And so she says the existence of colonization relies not only on ongoing occupation of land, but also occupation of regimes of knowledge erected to maintain and legitimate such occupation. So again, there is a connection between Indigenous peoples, between land, between colonization and knowledge and information. And I'll talk a little bit more about data, but we can think probably it isn't a big stretch when we think about what is in museums and recent stories around repatriation, around requests for return of objects, but also of ancestors, of people, of things that have provided a lot of foundational collections in museums, but also at universities, that these sort of are built, have created a sort of foundation for a lot of knowledge institutions. And again, universities are really implicated in this as well. And the ways that researchers have extracted knowledge from Indigenous communities. And we can think about early anthropologists and that work of collection, of also trying to document so-called sort of dying cultures. So decolonization invites us to look at the ways that colonization is active in our organizations and institutions, and our research practice and our professional practice. So really taking a step back and looking at those structures. How can we understand what's going on with our research at our institutions? How is our data being held and delivered? What are the kinds of things we have in collections? Because sometimes even things we have in collections are related to Indigenous people, although we may not realize it because perhaps they are the papers of someone who is not Indigenous. And those mentions of Indigenous people come in somewhere. So in Canada, we have the issue of missionaries, for example, or church records, where sometimes that's the only place you can see notated or documented evidence of Indigenous presence. So thinking very broadly about how we understand Indigenous materials is important. And decolonization is always political. So again, sometimes when we talk, or previously, probably, I think we've moved away from that somewhat when we talk about linked data or data work, metadata work, about data being objective. We know it is not. And decolonization work is always political because, again, it is really calling for the dismantling of colonial structures. And when we start to look at those structures, much of how we understand contemporary Western society is really built on these colonial structures. So when we think about understandings of ownership, so intellectual property law, how we understand ideas of citizens and identity and nationhood and all of those things that we take somewhat for granted are connected also to colonial mindsets. Anti-colonialism, I won't go into this too much. Well, if not somewhat, it is a related term. But again, this idea of resistance to colonial imperial powers. And again, I want to recognize that this is not new. There has been resistance to colonial powers for probably for all times. But these, again, we might talk about more in contemporary societies about intentioned resistant movements and thought and theory against these colonial structures, and specifically imperial powers. And so when I was thinking about this, many R words come to mind, things like resist, restore, repair, redress. Maybe you can think of some terms for yourself. There is also a framework for working with Indigenous communities called the 4 Rs in Canada, which refer to relevance, responsibility. And I should have written them down because now I'm going to forget what they all are, but I'll come back to it in a moment. So these ideas of how we understand what we can do in the face of colonization, and thinking about what that means specifically for us in the linked data community. So what are some concerns? And again, my lengthy land acknowledgement refer to some of these issues. So incorrect names, labels, data models, and concepts. So we heard also in the introduction about that relationship between machine learning, AI, and bias. So we know that many of our data models and conceptual models have problematic aspects to them. So what does it mean for us if we are working with systems that are inherently colonial, that have incorrect names, that have models that are not actually representing the way that Indigenous people or peoples in different communities represent themselves? We have many standards rooted in colonial practices. We have problematic or incorrect data relationships. So I'll talk in detail more about each of these items. Data governance becoming increasingly important when we talk about decolonization or Indigenous data. And provenance, collections and data. Where is this item from? How do we trace ideas of ownership and control? And what does that look like in the context of data? I think probably many people attending today know about problems in standards and headings. Again, this is not new. I know something I've been talking about for a number of years, and many others, that we have many of the standard terminologies used in libraries. So for example, Library of Congress subject headings are rooted in problematic colonial notions of Indigenous people, and for many other communities as well. So it is rooted in colonialism. It is good to remember that the control of data, and we're thinking about data, let's say in the 19th century, the sort of roots of bureaucratic processes, of office technologies. And when we start thinking about kind of the roots of where library data work really started, it is connected to the control and classification of people. So in colonial structures, we have the need to control, to classify who is Indigenous, who is not, who is in this category, how are we keeping track? And so many colonial agencies and governments developed bureaucratic systems that were connected to government agency to enact colonial aims, knowing who and who is not in a certain category and being able to control where they are, what they're doing, and where they are and are not allowed to go. So in Canada, under the Indian Act, there was a pass system. So Indigenous people were not actually allowed to leave reserves without express permission, again, up through the 1950s. So this systems of control and this honing of bureaucratic systems that are not unrelated to the kinds of systems of data and control that we have in libraries today. So Hannah Turner has a new book out, which I do not have the title right beside me, but talks about also how some of these bureaucratic systems that are currently present in museums have their roots also in early Indian agencies. And again, while I'm talking about North America, we can, I think, understand that this is happening elsewhere in the world, and that some of our current standards and practices, again, when we talk about information management, have some ties to these colonial agencies. Naming, really important. And to me, ethical Indigenous naming needs to be more than a label. So how do we actually understand the information that is around that label? How do we provide enough dimensions in our data and in our conceptual models so that we are really recognizing the needs of the communities that they refer to. So colonial renaming, misnaming, so that is coming in somewhere and giving a lake or a river another name in the name of that colonial institution. I'm outside of Toronto, is the Indigenous name is actually Takaranto, but it was called York for a long time. So there are lots of communities in Canada that are renamings of colonial names. So this is something we know, I think, for many of us that needs to change. But what are the implications for linked data when metadata is transformed or migrated from existing systems? So if you're not creating your data from scratch, if you're migrating existing library data, what does that mean when you are bringing along potentially problematic data? And then ensure linking is accurate and upholds Indigenous interests. So it's not enough. You may have the label correct in your data store, but what does it mean when we do a same as connection? So this is something I've been very interested in lately, and I have a chapter coming out probably early this year in a Library Juice Press. I think probably some of you listening maybe also might be associated with this this publication on linked data and ethics. But I did a sort of deeper dive in looking at Wikidata in relation to concepts of Métis peoplehood and nationhood, since that is my own community, and asking about what does it mean to try and understand the relationships between territory and people and nationhood and these questions when we look at data. And so I think it's important to recognize nations in Wikidata. Indigenous communities, I would say Indigenous nations, are actually in the category of ethnic group. And what we can see here is an ethnic group in Wikidata is not a people and is not a nation. And this matters because nations are connected to political interests and have, you can see here, nation, it's a political concept versus an ethnic group, which is actually conceptually different. And so when we do not recognize communities that have been subject to colonization, when we don't recognize those political rights in our data models, it is problematic. And so how do we figure this out? Because as I said, looking at colonization brings to the fore issues around our structures of our societies. And again, while I'm talking about, in this specific example, my own nation and in Canada, this really does speak to many, many other communities as well. So this is just another, it's very small, so you probably can't see it very well, but another example of where Métis are considered to be an ethnic group versus a nation. So if the country of Canada, for example, recognizes the Métis Nation in a nation-to-nation relationship, what does it mean when our data models do not? And then how do we handle documenting cultural data linked to colonization? So again, thinking about things in my local community that have certainly relationships, or what we see in across the world is we had a statue that was outside of Egerton Ryerson, who is a figure who's been implicated or connected to the residential school system in Canada, and outside what was Ryerson University, which has just been renamed to Toronto Metropolitan University, toppled. And actually, if you can see a little screenshot here, hopefully you can read it from Wikipedia, that the statue main body was thrown into the harbor and the head has been removed to be placed on a pike in an area that is subject to an Indigenous land protest. So what does that mean when we talk about linked data? I don't really have an answer for that, except that there is a Wikidata item for the statue of Egerton Ryerson, but this relatively recent event of the toppling and the separation of the parts of the statue are not represented in this Wikidata item. I don't know if it needs a new Wikidata item. I don't know if you modify. I think this is a question of how we handle documenting cultural data linked to colonization. What would that look like, and who does the documenting, I think, is another question when we start to see hopefully an increase in contending with legacies of colonialism within cultural monuments, within cultural institutions. How do we understand and do this also in a public-facing way, I think is another interesting question. Just keeping an eye on my time. So I would also like to say, I was thinking about this talk, that I'm totally guilty of techno-utopianism. I was just doing some reading about decolonization and data, digital humanities as I was preparing for this and thinking about it, because I have been active in the open access movement in Creative Commons for a very long time, in my entire professional career, I think really stemming from my first position that it was at a not-for-profit, where I had little access to the various riches of a university, for example. And so I really saw for a very long time a strong connection between open access, open data, open everything, and assumptions of equity. And in recent years, I've really tempered maybe a better way of saying it is I've come to a more nuanced understanding or feeling about open access, open data, public domain. I still continue to think it's really important. It's really important to think about equity of access. It is extremely important to think about how we make our data and information available to those who need it, especially publicly funded information. But in the context of decolonization, we actually need to call some of these assumptions about what it means to have open everything to account. It's actually not necessarily just or equitable to make everything open. And I think Maui Hudson, who is Indigenous data researcher and activist in New Zealand. I won't read again this whole quote, hopefully you can read it, but it talks about actually how there are connections between data resources and extraction and that history of use of materials in a problematic way. And so I think when we talk about what does it mean for our community, the linked data community, the open data community, we really need to come to this more nuanced understanding of what we mean by openness and what we mean by justice and equity. And again, this is not something that's just connected to Canada or countries that have maybe been more at the forefront of some of these Indigenous issues, but really for all of us in the data community to figure out and to think about what is that again, I like that he talks about capacity. And to thinking about where those power structures sit, because oftentimes a lot of the push for open access and open data are still coming from universities or for institutions that still have a great deal of power and kind of, again, are resting on these colonial structures. So it's really hard, I think, and I know that certainly it is a challenge for me to really think about how do we do this in a way that preserves what we think about as the positive of open access and open data, recognizing the need to step back from everything open all the time. Particularly if we look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has been widely adopted at this point, as a framework for considering the connection between Indigenous peoples around the world and human rights. And I think we can probably all, I hope, agree that looking at human rights frameworks, whether or not you feel you have a connection to Indigenous peoples, is a really important way of doing work that is therefore equitable and ethical. And it does not mean that there are not problems within these frameworks, because there certainly are. But Article 31, and this is just a part of it, really speaks to, I think, something that is important for our community to recognize, that if Indigenous people have the right to maintain, control, protect, develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and again, as well as manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, so not just what we might think of as traditional knowledge. And we can think about Indigenous data, Indigenous materials as being also anything that is connected to Indigenous territories. So even, again, for countries that may not actively be involved in colonial efforts or being on what are seen as colonial territories currently, to think about the benefits that are gained by access to colonial territories, or sorry, Indigenous territories. So again, how can we bring UNDRIP into or connect with our linked data initiatives and structures and opportunities? This does not mean, when I say this, oh, we shouldn't do anything open. That's not what I'm saying. But I think this is a really important point that we need to figure out. And so what is Indigenous data? It's really broad when you look at a lot of definitions. I'm just going to go back to this one for a sec. So Indigenous data, as I was mentioning, really broad. You can talk about Indigenous data as being related to things like environmental data or soil data, or data related to collections that involve Indigenous materials in some way. So Indigenous data is actually a very broad category. And Indigenous data sovereignty means that if we go back to thinking about Article 31 of UNDRIP, of Indigenous people having control of that data. So what does that mean when we talk about such a broad understanding of Indigenous data and the need to ensure that Indigenous people have control of that? And I think another important point when we talk about Indigenous data and Indigenous data sovereignty is to recognize that Indigenous people need to be involved in projects, structures to build capacity around working with Indigenous data. So again, there's a connection between decolonization efforts and Indigenous data. Just a screenshot here of GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. You can go check that out if you have not as of yet. And GIDA is responsible for the CARE principles. So it's like be fair and care. So we can think about the CARE principles as for Indigenous data governance is sitting alongside our FAIR principles. So again, it's not that things should not be open access or we shouldn't think about open data, but how can we do that work of creating or making data available, thinking about linked data in a way that also always has an eye to these CARE principles. And I think it's important to consider how we can do this really broadly. So not only when we think about, oh, we have Indigenous data, we need to do this, but how can we think about really transforming our whole community when it comes to thinking about these issues? Because again, when we talk about ethical practice of AI or ethical practice in relation to data principles, looking at these CARE principles for Indigenous data governance will help in all cases, I think, when it comes to ethical practice. And so recognizing that self-determination is really important. And this is another way of thinking about Indigenous data. again, and not just for countries or places that are obviously connected to Indigenous people, but thinking about that in its most broad sense, no matter where it is in the world. So if you have something that is related to an Indigenous territory, past or present, Indigenous collections, how can we make sure that we have appropriate mechanisms in place for data governance? I wanted to make mention, although it is not out yet, very, very soon, I'm involved in a working group for the IEEE P2890, so recommended practice for the prominence of Indigenous peoples data, that I think, we will see these tools and ways of working that are going to help the linked data community be able to adopt some of these practices within our work more easily. So this should be coming out in the new year, I think is the current plan. So have a look out for that. Just mentioning some specific things right now. So I know some of you probably have seen me talk previously about Indigenous terminologies. This project has had a number of iterations. So currently, we have a new iteration of this project, which is the Respectful Indigenous Terminologies Platform Project. I won't read this whole out, but it's really conceived as a multi-year project. You might have seen an earlier iteration where we were looking at Wikibase for some of our headings, but moving that conversation along to think of more about a platform that can hold various terminology sets that can be contributed and vetted in different ways. This project, multilingual, with a focus on Indigenous oversight and protocols, the fair and care principles, all of the good things I think that we would like to see in a platform. So we are conceiving of this as a 6-year project. And so with that, I think heading off into our conversation, I mentioned a number of things around decolonization. And I think part of the challenge is, again, looking at the things we take as or assumptions about ways that we work, and thinking about how can we imagine this decolonized future into being? How can we ensure that when we are doing linked data work, that we are building in capacity and structures to account for Indigenous self-determination? When we talk about provenance, how do we understand provenance not only of Indigenous data, but collections, materials? How do we ensure that we are appropriately building capacity and ensuring that our data models, I think this goes for ethical practice in general, ensuring that we have conceptual models, terminology, labels, linking, that is all appropriate and is going to ensure the best and most ethical way of working. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm hoping we have some questions we can go to in this last bit of time we have. I think we've got time.
Thank you very much, Stacy. Yes, we have some time left.
Okay, good.
Thanks for the great keynote. I hope you haven't been feeling too lonely there. Not getting any visual feedback.
Yes, I do miss the room full of faces. That is for sure. So thank you.
Okay, yeah, we have some questions in the town square. Kat will read them.
Thank you for your talk. Ruth asks, how has repatriation been documented or described in places like Wikidata? Also theft, for example, the Benin bronzes or the Elgin marbles.
That's a great question. I actually have not looked at repatriation specifically in Wikidata. If somebody has, please do jump in. That's not something I've contended with, but I do think it is, as I said, important to consider, and maybe that's something I would love to have that conversation actually about that. So if people have been looking at that, I would love to be part of that conversation, because I think, like the question of the statue, it brings up also different views of something. And again, my example at the beginning of the Government of Canada's open data set that says, here's our data. This is the treaties of land that we have, with a small sentence that says, well, some Indigenous people may feel differently, but this is what it is. So how do we have those different views of things, but also what does it mean to bring that kind of data into Wikidata, which is such an open and, I want to use sort of community data set. So I don't know if anybody wants to answer that one better than I just did.
Well, we can continue that conversation
yes.
in Mattermost. We do have another question. Jakob asks, which strategies exist to not increase inequity via open data? Directly contact Indigenous people and ask for their needs, but how to find out who might be affected by the data?
That's a really good question. And I think, so, and there's one, I think that is maybe constantly being negotiated. So part of what I didn't say today is it is good to know your own data and your own collection. So can you understand whose data it is? Who are the communities? So, and sometimes, the reality is that certainly some communities no longer exist in a way that we can consult with that community. So understand whose data it is. Try to understand in the community who you can go and speak to. Often communities have, so if you're talking about Indigenous communities, there may be a council, or there may be community members that you would be the way to open a conversation, to understand that this typically may not be very, very fast. So if you're looking for like a couple of day turnaround, not likely to happen in that way. So give yourself time. And really, I would say build up capacity in organizations to think about how you have your own ways of understanding how to work with Indigenous data and communities. I know that lots of institutions, certainly in Canada, are starting to do that because communities may not have time to get back to you very quickly. They're often very busy, and also might have different ideas about whether that data can be open or not. It is also possible to have multiple communities claim ownership over a particular data set. So again, not easy, but I think giving time and space, and to recognize that you really do need community, if possible, permission to make something open. And certainly we have the local context labels, or traditional knowledge labels. If you haven't seen those, you can just Google traditional knowledge labels and you'll find them. And they're a really good set of protocols also for understanding how you can apply different levels of open or not on certain kinds of materials or data. And also there's some good advice just even on approaching or protocols for approaching communities. So I would recommend that. And again, when we look at things like the prominence of Indigenous data that's going to come out soon, we're going to see, I think, more and more frameworks that are going to be helpful when we want to actually look at whether data should be open or not, where we store it, how we keep it, whose it really should be, should we even have them of that data? Because sometimes researchers give data to universities, for example, and there might actually be an Indigenous component to that data that researcher may not be alerting the university to.
Thank you for your answer, Stacy. That is, if we still have time, a question from Daniel. While acknowledging techno-utopianism as a trap, is it useful to take advantage of linked data's ability to support different and potentially conflicting statements about a given entity, event, person, place, with reification of the sort enabled by Wikidata to cite different sources for each claim? I'm thinking, for example, about your example of the toppling of Ryerson's statue, which was largely covered by mainstream press, not just the Toronto Sun, as vandalism.
Yes, yes. I mean, I'm always optimistic about technology. So, yeah, it's potentially. I think, there's some challenges. I kind of go, I'll just be completely honest, between like, I love Wikidata, and I'm like, oh, Wikidata has so many problems that it's sometimes hard to think about how to do something, for example, like the Ryerson statue, in a way that is appropriate, because we can potentially end up encoding harmful things into the data about communities, right? So we're talking about whether something is genocide or not, or whether something is vandalism or not. The context of course, the statues is quite, I'm sure for many places, a sort of hot button topic when we talk about moving statues or vandalism of statues. And so there is this veneer of objectivity to data that I think can make it look like both sides, it's so hard to talk, both sides are equal, but is it really when we talk about human rights, or when we talk about the existence of peoples and communities and concerns that are quite serious? So I'm not sure, and I leave this as an open question. I really would love to talk to people about this. How do you apply weights or understandings within that context of Wikidata to ensure that there is enough context for that data to be reused in a way that is going to be, and again, when we're talking about decolonization, addressing problematic colonial structures? Because certainly that particular statue there's a lot of people who are saying Ryerson wasn't that bad. He was really very positive for the most part. There's just this small problem. So what does that mean in that context? I'm curious to try out different mechanisms. I think that's my answer, and to see about what that can look like. But I also quite honestly think there's a lot of education that needs to happen within the Wikidata community to understand some of the context around certain data items or certain issues. Again, going back to even the issue of nation or ethnicity, if you deny the fact that there might be, that Indigenous peoples might actually have nations, what does that mean in the context of a giant open data store like Wikidata? I think there's real challenges, and it's not just when we talk about decolonization. I think we can talk about lots of kinds of communities that have faced problematic circumstances when we talk about something Wikidata. So I remain hopeful, and I'm curious, and I think there's possibilities, but there's also, I would just say, the community dimension of something like Wikidata that's important to recognize as well, because we're all coming in from different places and understandings.
Thank you for that response. Our next question is from Laura. Interesting challenge for metadata creators for libraries and museums. There are similarities with the situation with LGBTQ plus terminology. Our library sponsored a Homosaurus workshop. I get the feeling that a workshop is not going to transmit the knowledge or sensitivity needed for this decolonization approach or topic going forward. But could you recommend any starting places?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably for a lot of these topics, one workshop is probably not going to be enough, quite frankly. I mean, educate yourself. So I had the screenshot of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. There's really great videos actually out of the traditional knowledge labels. Those labels are to do with Indigenous protocols. There's lots and lots of information about Indigenous data sovereignty that's really helpful, I think, in getting your head around how self-determination and sovereignty connect to data. And once you start making that connection, then you can move to other things, because actually that has an impact on terms. So the terms that people call themselves are actually related to self-determination, which is related to rights. And so we have this sort of nested, or this sort of series of shifts that need to happen in how we understand data, because one of the challenges in working in metadata as well is a lot of our data practices are rooted in also sort of thinking about universals. So we have one system, we have universal ways of approaching it. And the wonderful thing I would just say about linked data, and it's something that I've been excited about for a long time, is the possibility of having multiplicities. So we can have a multiplicity of systems sitting alongside each other, as we were just talking about with the statutes. We can have statements that disagree. We can have ways that we can move through data in a way that is very different from having sort of the closed, I'm thinking about library catalogs, where we don't have that interaction, or we have one system of vocabulary. So being able to consider how we have multiplicity versus thinking universals is also really important to understand. There's not, decolonization is not something that is one way of looking at it, and that many Indigenous nations have completely different ways of understanding and approaching the world. So that recognition that there's no pan-indigeneity is also important in making that shift from we understand working with Indigenous data. So I would recommend looking at some of those sites, and there are lots of great videos, talks, articles. I could probably send some out if that's of interest.
Okay, thanks again, Stacy, and for your answers as well. I have to make a break here, so we are already 2 minutes over time, and the speakers of the next sessions are knocking on the door, eager to come in. Thank you, and I hope you will join the discussion in the MetaMost later. And yeah, I saw you registered for a workshop